Hello. You have joined the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Boards, or CSB's public business meeting. We will now begin this meeting with Steve Owens, Chairperson of the CSB.
Well, thank you, Brian, and hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Steve Owens. I'm the Chairperson of the Chemical Safety Board. Welcome to our third public meeting of calendar year 2024 and our final scheduled public meeting of this fiscal year. You know, today's meeting is also a little bit of a milestone for us at the CSB. It was just a little over 2 years ago that the former CSB chairperson resigned, and board member Sylvia Johnson and I began the important work of rebuilding and revitalizing this agency. And we were very fortunate to be joined in that effort by board member Kathy Sandoval, who arrived at the CSB in February of last year. You know, we've come a very long way in the last 2 years. As you all know, at the end of last year, we completely eliminated the enormous backlog of investigation reports that had accumulated under prior agency leadership and had plagued the CSB for so many years. Thanks to the hard work and commitment of every single person at the CSB, working together as a team, between late July 2022 and December 2023, we issued 17 investigation reports in just 17 months. The most reports that the CSB has ever issued in such a short period of time, completely eliminating the backlog. On top of that, last month, we issued another final report that was not part of the backlog. This one was for our investigation into the September 2022 fatal fire at the BP Husky refinery near Toledo, Ohio, that tragically took the lives of 2 brothers who worked at the refinery. With the backlog eliminated, we are now focusing our limited resources on other matters that have needed attention. As I reported at our last public meeting, in March, we launched investigations into toxic chemical releases at 2 facilities in Louisiana that were reported to the CSB under our accidental release reporting rule. The first was the release of hydrogen fluoride and chlorine at the Honeywell Performance Materials facility in Geismar, Louisiana, that occurred in January of 2023. The other was the release of ethylene oxide at the Dow Chemical facility in Plaquemine, Louisiana, that occurred in July of 2023. We recently issued updates for both of these investigations, and those updates are available on the CSB website. In addition, we also launched investigations into 2 other very serious incidents that occurred just in the last couple of months. The first is the fatal fire at the TSUSA liquid nitriding facility in Chattanooga, Tennessee, that happened on May 30th. The second is another release of highly toxic hydrofluoric acid that occurred on June 7th at the Honeywell facility in Geismar, Louisiana, that seriously injured a worker. And yes, that's the same facility where our investigation of the January 2023 HF and chlorine release already was underway. So now we have 2 investigations at the Honeywell facility. The investigations are running concurrently, and the same investigation team is handling both. And as we've initiated these new investigations, we've continued to move forward with our investigation into the November 2023 fire at the Marathon Renewables facility in Martinez, California, which seriously injured an employee who suffered 3rd-degree burns over most of his face and body. We released an update on the Marathon investigation back in February, and you'll hear more about that investigation later in this meeting. Altogether, the CSB now has 5 current investigations underway: Marathon, Dow, TSUSA, and the 2 at Honeywell. And finally, just today, we released a new safety study calling for greater use of remote isolation equipment in chemical facilities. The study and recommendations we are making in it are based on several catastrophic incidents investigated by the CSB, where remote isolation equipment likely could have prevented or at least significantly reduced fatalities, serious injuries, and substantial property damage at those facilities and in the surrounding communities. The new safety study is available on the CSB website. So you can see we have been very busy over the last couple of years and certainly in recent months. And during today's meeting, you'll hear presentations from CSB staff about our BP Husky investigation, as well as the Honeywell, Dow, TSUSA, and Marathon investigations. You'll also hear a presentation about our new safety study on remote isolation equipment. But before I turn the floor over to my fellow board members for their remarks, I want to take care of one bit of housekeeping, as we do at each of these meetings. At the end of today's presentation, we will provide an opportunity for public comments. And in the interest of time, we ask that you please keep your comments to 3 minutes. And please use the icon on your screen to raise your hand so that you can be recognized to speak. If you'd prefer to submit written comments, you can send those to public@csb.gov. That's public, PUBLIC, @csb.gov. Now I'd like to turn this over to Board Member Sylvia Johnson for her remarks, and then to Board Member Kathy Sandoval. Sylvia, please go ahead, and then Kathy, please do so as well when Sylvia's concluded. And again, thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Steve. And greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's meeting. As the chairperson, excuse me, just covered an extensive and impressive list of accomplishments this team has made over the past 2 years, you can see that the staff has made tremendous strides to protect the millions of Americans whose daily occupations involve highly hazardous working conditions. The contributions this team has made to advance chemical safety cannot be overstated. These accomplishments contribute in ways that allow the full range of internal and external stakeholders to be confident in the CSB's readiness and capabilities. The CSB team has routinely demonstrated the importance of rigor, scientific integrity, a strong grasp of good engineering practices, and the importance of protecting communities, workers, and the environment. In so doing, we've continued to meet the agency's mission as well as rebuild and maintain the trust of our stakeholders. As part of our commitment to stakeholder engagement, since our last meeting, our senior chemical incident investigator, Dan Tolima, and I had the opportunity to meet with another one of our stakeholders, the American Chemistry Council's Process Safety Committee. In that meeting, we discussed the CSB's accidental release reporting rule, which requires the owner or operator of a stationary source to report any accidental release resulting in a fatality, serious injury, or substantial property damage to the CSB within 8 hours. The accidental release reporting rule database has been an important tool in guiding the work of the CSB. Our engagement with ACC participants in that meeting gave us the opportunity to instill a level of continued confidence in the way the CSB gathers relevant information while considering a broad range of issues and factors impacting communities, workers, and the environment. As has already been noted, momentarily our investigators are going to be presenting findings on the 2022 fatal fire and chemical release at the BP Husky refinery in Oregon, Ohio. Before the final report was released to the public, I traveled with the investigative team to Ohio to meet with the families of the 2 brothers who perished in this horrific accident. In keeping with our mission to determine the cause or probable cause of chemical incidents, the team and I met with the families to share our findings. In that meeting, I was also able to once again extend condolences from the entire CSB team to the Morrissey family who continues to grieve. Without question, these past 2 years have shown us that by constantly evaluating internal and external factors that impact our work, we're making a difference. With our current capabilities and staffing levels, we're now able to both produce reports as well as to continue to deploy teams of investigators to a range of incidents. So I would like to take this opportunity to applaud the entire CSB team and my board colleagues for the work we've been able to collectively do to assure that we continue to meet the mission of the CSB. Thank you, and now to you, Kathy.
Well, thank you very much, Sylvia, Dr. Johnson. Really appreciate the remarks of our chair, Steve Owens, and also Sylvia, and want to echo their remarks in saying thank you to the entire CSB team. Every single person has played a huge role in completing these investigations, initiating new investigations, supporting the travel of people as necessary for investigations, outreach, and training. And also especially thank Sylvia and the investigative team for meeting with the family and for your compassion as you're also explaining our findings. So one thing I wanted to highlight about the BP Husky investigation that Sylvia was just talking about, and we'll hear from more details from our investigative team, is that in the 24 hours before the explosion happened that led to the lives being lost of the two workers who were brothers, there were more than 3,700 alarms warning of primarily overfilling and overpressurization. So as you'll hear more, there were mad scrambles, there were meetings during that time period. But what didn't happen was that even though they had stop work authority, they didn't exercise their authority to stop work. And so this reminds us that process safety management requires not just alarm monitoring and alarm management, but real analysis and action to recognize what's going on and to recognize that sometimes that the best course of action is to stop. And the mission of everyone, including the operators, is to protect people and the planet, as well as their critical infrastructure, their plant. And unfortunately, despite all of these alarms, there also was not good communication about the analysis that happened in the meetings. And thus, we see not just the ultimate cause, but the root cause. And I think that this is part of what the CSB brings to these investigations, is its terrific analysis of the root cause. I'd also just like to briefly highlight, we'll hear about a number of the other ongoing investigations, but we're also going to hear about a safety study that we just released. So Steve Owens mentioned it briefly regarding remote isolation equipment, including remote isolation valves. So one thing I wanted to underscore is that this is not a technology problem. The technology exists in multiple ways to do remote isolation equipment and be able to incorporate it within existing systems so that when you get alarms with the touch of a button, then a vessel can be turned off and you don't have overpressurization, or you don't have to send out a person to turn off a valve. So I think this is a really good study that also highlights the multiple incidents we've seen. And again, we need to recognize this is not a technology problem. This is a safety decision problem. So, look forward to our discussions about how we could continue to make better process safety management decisions. And I thank you all very much and look forward to the reports and to everyone's comments. So thank you, and back to you, Chairman Owens.
Well, thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Sylvia, for those great comments. And as we all said, we very much appreciate all the hard work and commitment of every single person here at the CSB to not only help us clear out the backlog, but to issue the new report on the BP Husky investigation, get the safety study out, as well as launch several new investigations. We've got a long way to go, but we're clearly headed in the right direction. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our Executive Director of Investigations and Recommendations, Steve Kleist, who will then lead us through the presentations that we've just mentioned. So, Steve, take it away.
Well, thank you, Steve. The Office of Investigations and Recommendations team members have been fully engaged in the execution of the agency's core mission. We have a series of presentations that we're going to be making this afternoon to provide the audience with an update on current investigations, and as we mentioned before, the safety study, but also the key findings and cause of the incident that took place at the BP Husky facility in Oregon, Ohio. This was a very significant loss of containment event, and the lessons learned will certainly benefit the entire refining community. So with that, we will start off with the presentation of the BP Husky investigation findings. Making the presentation this afternoon will be Bill Steiner, the investigator in charge, and he will also be accompanied by the deputy investigator in charge, Melinda Hartz. So Bill, please proceed.
Thank you, Executive Director Kleist. I'll proceed with the overview of the incident. So Brian, if you can go to the next slide. The BP Husky Toledo refinery incident occurred on Tuesday, September 20th, 2022. Two BP employees, Ben and Max Morrissey, who were brothers, were fatally injured. Property damages, including loss of use until the refinery restarted on June 7th, 2023, were estimated at over $597 million. BP estimated that over 23,000 pounds of naphtha were released during the incident. This simplified process flow diagram illustrates the relevant portions of the BP Toledo refinery involved in the incident. From the left, crude oil is stored in tanks and pumped to a crude tower. The overhead of the crude tower flows to a crude overhead accumulator. Liquid from that crude overhead accumulator can flow to three places: the coker gas plant, the naphtha hydrotreater, known as the NHT unit, and to light virgin naphtha storage. Coker wet gas is treated in the coker gas plant to remove hydrogen sulfide. The coker gas plant is a relatively new unit at the refinery, having started up in 2018. Treated gas from the coker gas plant is sent to the refinery fuel gas mix drum, where it mixes with other refinery fuel gas mix streams before being burned in refinery boilers and furnaces. When the night shift arrived on the September 20th, 2022 evening, the NHT had already been shut down and the naphtha feed flow control valve to the coker gas plant had been closed due to a loss of containment incident earlier in the day at the refinery. To adjust for the NHT being down, the night shift board operators made a rapid and drastic crude slate change, eliminating the light crude oil feed to the crude tower, which eventually led to a high-level upset in the crude overhead accumulator. The night shift board operators decided to move the high liquid level in the crude overhead accumulator to the NHT feed surge drum and opened the naphtha feed control valve to the coker gas plant. The coker gas plant had a vapor bypass line that had remained in service. The first distillation tower in the coker gas plant, the absorber stripper tower, had a remote operated emergency isolation valve on the liquid leaving the bottom of the tower. The day shift had closed this valve after the loss of the containment event earlier in the day. The naphtha from that crude overhead accumulator soon began to fill the coker gas plant absorber stripper tower, and liquid naphtha overflowed out the coker gas plant vapor bypass line and began to fill the fuel gas mix drum. The naphtha filled the fuel gas mix drum in approximately 7 minutes and then overflowed the refinery furnaces and boilers, which began to smoke. Field operators received a radio call from a board operator to check the level in the fuel gas mix drum. The field operators began draining the fuel gas mix drum level to the refinery flare in a closed piping system and also to a refinery oily water sewer. To lower the level in the fuel gas mix drum as fast as possible, field operators also released naphtha directly from the pressurized fuel gas mix drum. This included removing a blind flange from a 2-inch valve on the side of the fuel gas mix drum and opening the valve. The released liquid formed a vapor cloud and found an ignition source, likely a nearby crude furnace. The CSB determined the cause of the incident was operators opening valves and removing a flange on the pressurized fuel gas mix drum to release flammable liquid naphtha directly to the ground. And after being released to the ground, the flammable liquid formed a vapor cloud that reached a nearby ignition source, resulting in a flash fire. The CSB also identified the following contributed to the incident: A failure to implement effective preventive safeguards for the overflow of towers and vessels, leading to an over-reliance on human intervention to prevent incidents. A failure to implement a shutdown or put the crude unit on hot circulation through the use of stop work authority or otherwise. Ineffective policies, procedures, and practices at the refinery to avoid and control abnormal situations. The alarm system, which flooded the operators with alarms throughout the day, resulting in poor decision-making and a failure to learn from previous incidents. Now, investigator Melinda Hartz will review the safety issues analyzed by the CSB.
Thank you, Bill. The CSB identified 4 safety issues associated with this incident: overflow prevention, abnormal situation management, alarm flood, and learning from previous incidents. Next, we will briefly discuss each safety issue. The first safety issue is overflow prevention. The CSB found that while the BP Toledo refinery did identify safeguards for the absorber stripper tower and fuel gas mixture overflow scenarios, these safeguards were mitigative rather than preventive. For example, safety instrumented systems were programmed to shut down furnaces, but liquid first had to overflow from the absorber stripper tower to the fuel gas mixture and finally to the furnaces for the safety instrumented systems to activate. Pressure relief devices on top of the absorber stripper tower were also identified safeguards, but because of the piping elevation, absorber stripper tower overflowed to the fuel gas mix drum before the liquid level reached the pressure relief devices, rendering them ineffective as overflow safeguards. The BP Toledo refinery relied on operators to respond to high-level liquid alarms in the absorber stripper tower and the fuel gas mix drum. The original coker gas plant design considered an automatic interlock to close the naphtha flow control valve to the absorber stripper tower when high level was detected, but ultimately the interlock was not implemented. On the day of the incident, such an interlock would have stopped the flow of liquid naphtha before it reached the fuel gas mix drum. The next safety issue is abnormal situation management. Several events leading up to the incident contributed to the incident itself. On the morning of the incident, an overpressure occurred in NHT preheat, which caused a pressure relief device to chatter. Excessive vibration from the chatter caused a pipe rupture and loss of containment. The refinery initiated an emergency shutdown of the NHT unit. As a result, the crude tower operation destabilized, causing 11 overpressure events on the crude tower across approximately 6 hours. Just after night shift started, around 5 p.m., a board operator made the large crude slate change that Bill talked about earlier. This feed change started another crude tower upset and the crude overhead accumulator overfill that ultimately led to the incident. An abnormal situation is defined as a disturbance in an industrial process with which the basic process control system cannot cope. Some of the abnormal situations that occurred that day are shown in the blue boxes. Each abnormal situation in blue led to consequences in orange that often resulted in further abnormal situations and/or poor decision-making, as shown by the red arrows. Having a plan in place to manage predictable abnormal situations minimizes the effects of these abnormal situations and reduces the stress and decision fatigue that can result. The BP Toledo refinery's attempts to keep the crude unit operating while the crude tower was unstable set the stage for later consequences up to and including the release to the ground. Abnormal situation management could have provided the refinery employees with a clear stop point at which they could have shut down or stopped feed to the crude tower and avoided the later abnormal situations that led to the incident. The third safety issue is alarm flood. Alarm flood is defined as more than 10 alarms in a 10-minute time block per board operator. In the 12 hours leading up to the incident, board operators for the crude unit experienced over 3,700 alarms. The peak alarm rate, which occurred around 20 minutes before the incident, was 281 alarms in 10 minutes. The extended period of high alarm rates contributed to the incident, much like the abnormal situations just discussed. Board operators were overloaded for hours before the incident occurred, leading to miscommunications, poor shift turnover, and errors in responding to or missed alarms. Finally, the fourth safety issue is learning from previous incidents. During its investigation, the CSB found that the Toledo refinery had experienced a similar incident in 2019. After a refinery upset, the absorber stripper tower overflowed into the fuel gas mix drum, much like this 2022 incident. However, in the 2019 incident, a board operator closed the naphtha flow control valve to the absorber stripper tower in time to prevent overflow to downstream furnaces. The refinery completed a 5Y investigation of this incident, shown in green. The investigation followed a linear thought process and did not identify other potential causal branches, shown in gray. The 2019 investigation overlooked the possibility of preventing absorber stripper tower or fuel gas mix drum overflow. And the BP Toledo refinery did not add automated preventive safeguards, but continued to rely on human intervention. In addition to the 2019 incident at Toledo, BP experienced an incident at its Texas City refinery in 2005, which fatally injured 15 workers and injured 180 others. The CSB noted several similarities between the Texas City incident and this 2022 Toledo incident. Among these were level indications on towers or vessels and graphic displays that misled operators and made troubleshooting more difficult, no automated controls to prevent overfill, and a lack of well-documented complete shift turnover. The parallels between the Texas City incident and the 2022 Toledo incident led the CSB to conclude that the BP Toledo refinery did not effectively apply lessons or institutionalize the knowledge of overflow scenarios from the fatal Texas City incident.
And Brian, I'll pick up and go over the recommendations to prevent future incidents. The CSB issued recommendations to the Ohio Refining Company, the American Petroleum Institute, and the International Society of Automation. The current owner of the Toledo refinery, the Ohio Refining Company, is a subsidiary of Synovus Energy, and the CSB recommends the Toledo refinery should establish effective preventative safeguards that use engineered controls to prevent liquid overflow and not rely solely on human intervention. The Toledo refinery should clearly give employees the authority to stop work perceived as unsafe until the employer can resolve the matter. Provide procedures and regular training on how employees can exercise stop work authority, emphasizing exercising this authority during abnormal situations, including alarm floods. And the Toledo refinery should implement a new abnormal situation management policy to reduce the decision-making load on operations personnel during abnormal situations and provide guidance on recognizing when an abnormal situation is becoming too difficult to manage without shutting a process down. Finally, the Toledo refinery should modify the Toledo alarm philosophy to include analyzing individual alarm flood events and not limiting the analysis to a single metric average over a month, which can mask significant alarm flood events. To the API, CSB recommended developing a new publication or revising an existing publication, such as API recommended practice for instrumentation control and protective system for gas-fired heaters, to incorporate the process hazards associated with liquid overflow from a fuel gas mixture. CSB also recommends that API develop a publication to prevent the overflow of pressure vessels such as towers and drums, similar to what can be found in API recommended practice for offshore production facilities API recommended practice for process measurement, the API standard for pressure relieving systems, and the API standard for overfill prevention for storage tanks and petroleum facilities. And finally, to the International Society of Automation, CSB recommends revising the industry RAGA gap, ANSI 18.2, management of alarm systems for the process industries, to include performance targets for short-term alarm flood analysis so users evaluate alarm flood performance for a single alarm flood event. A target peak flood alarm flood rate should also be defined to establish trigger points that require alarm performance improvement actions. And with that, this concludes the BP Husky investigation presentation.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for that presentation. And Melinda, also thanks to your work in bringing this to its successful closure. I'd also like to recognize other investigators that made significant contributions to the investigation report. Lauren Johnson, who is the supervisory chemical incident investigator, Vonzella Vincent, another chemical incident investigator, along with Don Nixon, another chemical incident investigator who participated in the report development. Also would like to thank the members of the deployment team that went to the scene to conduct the initial on-scene investigative work. And that included Bill Steiner, Melinda Hartz, Vonzella Vincent, Lauren Johnson, Dan Talima, Cruz Redmond, and Ben Schrader. The next presentation will be on the Dow chemical incident that is currently an open investigation. And Ben Schrader, who is the investigator in charge, will be making that presentation. So Ben, please proceed.
Thank you. Next slide. This investigation is of the incident that occurred on July 14th, 2023 at approximately 9:17 p.m. An explosion shook the Dow, Louisiana operations glycol 2 plant in Plaquemine, Louisiana. Multiple subsequent explosions and fires damaged nearby piping and equipment, including a reflux drum. This incident resulted in injuries, but also substantial property damage occurred at the facility. As a result, local authorities issued a shelter in place affecting hundreds of nearby residents. Over 31,000 pounds of ethylene oxide, a carcinogenic substance, was released during the incident. This incident shift, next slide. The evening shift of Friday, July 14th, 2023 started out with glycol 2 unit operating under normal conditions. At approximately 6:52, one of the finishing column's reflux pumps, circled in red, shut down due to excessive vibration. Then at 6:54, process operators inspected the pump and it was restarted. However, pump vibrations continued over the next couple of hours after the shutdown, but during this time period, the vibration level never reached the high level, resulting in an automated pump shutdown. Next slide. Following the reflux drum shutdown and restart, the ethylene oxide finishing process experienced numerous operational upsets, mostly liquid level related. At approximately 8:45 p.m., the board operator radioed the process operators, requesting them to check on a piece of process equipment located in the vicinity of the reflux drum. Then at 9:17 p.m., an explosion occurred in the vicinity of the reflux drum. Following the initial explosion, a fire developed near the reflux drum. Shortly after the initial explosion, the reflux drum, which was approximately half full of liquid ethylene oxide, exploded. Also following the initial explosion, the two process operators who were working nearby immediately evacuated the area around the reflux drum. Then at 9:20 p.m., approximately 3 minutes after the initial explosion, Dow responders quickly arrived at the scene for firefighting. Last slide. The photo on the left shows the remains of the reflux drum that was recovered after the incident. It provides an example of the incredible forces involved when the drum exploded. The CSB continues gathering facts and analyzing several key issues that appear involved in this incident. First, emergency pressure relief. Next, reactive chemical hazards, maintenance, and lastly, the relevant practices and standards applicable at the Dow Plaquemine facility, at Dow Chemicals corporate technical standards, and relevant chemical industry safety standards. That concludes this update of the agency's investigation of last year's Dow Plaquemine, Louisiana incident. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be returning the virtual podium back to Executive Director Kleist.
Well, thank you, Ben, for that update. It was very informative, and we look forward to this closure of this investigation. The next presentation will be made by Drew Solly, the investigator in charge of the Honeywell Performance Materials and Technologies investigation. Drew, please proceed with the presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Drew Solly. I'm the investigator in charge of both Honeywell investigations. I'll start with the January 2023 reboiler failure. Honeywell makes a variety of products at its facility in Geismar, Louisiana. Among the various products produced is a refrigerant known as HFC 245FA. This production unit utilizes, among other chemicals, highly toxic chlorine and hydrogen fluoride, or HF. Both chemicals are immediately dangerous to life and health at concentrations of 10 to 30 parts per million. The HFC 245FA unit contains several distillation columns, at least one of which utilizes a kettle-style reboiler. A generic conceptual diagram of a distillation column with a kettle-style reboiler is shown above. The reboiler was a shell and tube style heat exchanger with a single pass U-tube bundle. The process fluid, which was normally a mixture of HF, HFC 245FA, and other process intermediates, occupied the shell side of the heat exchanger, and Honeywell used steam on the tube side as the heating medium. On the evening of January 23rd, 2023, Honeywell began restarting the HFC 245FA unit after a utility outage at the facility. Operations established feed to the distillation column at 7:16 p.m. and at 8:12 p.m. the reboiler suddenly catastrophically ruptured. At the time of the incident, the process conditions inside the reboiler shell were within the reboiler's normal as designed safe operating limits. The process fluids in the reboiler shell were held in the liquid phase and above their normal atmospheric boiling points, and so as a result, when the shell catastrophically ruptured, the contents began to instantly vaporize. This phenomenon is known as a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, or a BLEVE. The reboiler shell ruptured into at least 9 fragments, which were propelled up to 35 feet from the reboiler's original location. Additionally, a large vapor cloud containing highly toxic HF and chlorine engulfed part of the HFC 245FA unit. Fortunately, no workers were in the vicinity of the explosion, and as a result, there were no injuries. Honeywell estimated that the property damage caused by the incident was roughly $4 million. The reboiler shell is nominally a 1/2 inch thick with a corrosion allowance of 1/8 of an inch. It has a maximum allowable working pressure of 200 pounds per square inch gauge at a temperature of 300 degrees Fahrenheit. The reboiler shell was last replaced in 2012 after the shell experienced HF corrosion thinning and required replacement. Honeywell's Mechanical Integrity Organization inspected the reboiler in September 2020 using ultrasonic thickness examination. At that time, the site MI organization estimated 1.1 years of remaining service life for the reboiler shell, and the shell was placed back in service according to site practice. The site again inspected the shell in October of 2021 when it conducted an internal visual inspection. At this time, the site MI organization recommended that the shell be replaced at the next shutdown opportunity. In January of 2022, a project engineer initiated a capital project request to purchase a new shell. The project was approved by management, but was never funded or carried out. Ultimately, the shell was run to failure on January 23rd, 2023, when it catastrophically ruptured. The CSB's investigation is ongoing. The investigation team is examining, among many things, Honeywell's policies and practices for mechanical integrity and capital project management. That concludes my update for the January 2023 reboiler failure, and I'll now move on to the June 2024 HF release and serious injury. On June 7th, 2024, a contract pipe fitter working at the Honeywell Geismar facility was exposed to less than 1 pound of HF while performing maintenance work in the HFC 245FA unit. The contractor was not wearing respiratory protection. He spent roughly 2 days in the hospital and was released. The investigation is ongoing, and the CSB is examining Honeywell's policies and practices for control of hazardous energy and line breaking, among other topics. This concludes my discussion of the ongoing Honeywell investigations. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Drew, for the presentation and you and your team's work and the investigation activities that have been going on since the deployment. The next presentation will focus on the incident that occurred at the TSUSA facility in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Cruz Redmond is the investigator in charge, and he will make the presentation this afternoon. So Cruz, please proceed.
Thank you, Executive Director Kleist. Good afternoon. My name is Cruz Redmond, and I am the investigator in charge of the CSB's investigation of the incident that occurred on May 30th, 2024 at the TSUSA liquid nitriding facility in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'll be providing a brief update on the status of this investigation today. TSUSA is a subsidiary of the company called HEF USA, which is a wholly subsidiary company of an international company, HEF Group, which is headquartered in France. The TSUSA company operates multiple facilities throughout the US where it performs different treatments to harden and improve wear resistance of metal parts. At the Chattanooga facility, which an example of one of their nitriding facilities is shown in the top photo. TSUSA performs this process on various different types of metal parts. Liquid nitriding, which the process can be seen on the bottom right from right to left, is a process by which metal parts are submerged through a series of water and molten salt baths by an overhead crane. During the introduction to the nitriding step, nitrogen diffuses through the metal to strengthen the part. During the oxidizing step, a corrosion-resistant layer forms over the part to provide additional protection. On the morning of May 30th, the employees of TSUSA were reprocessing metal parts through the reintroduction into the oxidizing step of the process. At approximately 8:58 a.m., a process upset occurred while reprocessing these metal parts. The upset resulted in the eruption of chemicals from a process vessel, which released a mixture of high pH molten sodium hydroxide into the processing area. The release contacted multiple employees, fatally injuring one employee. One other employee suffered minor injuries due to the chemical release. The chemical release also ignited several small fires throughout the facility, and this resulted in the initial reports of this incident being referred to as a flash fire, generated from the multiple fires throughout the facility caused by the release. On June 4th, the CSB launched its investigation into the incident at the TSUSA facility in Chattanooga, Tennessee. During its initial field activities, the team interviewed multiple eyewitnesses, other company employees, identified key evidence, and documented the site through photography and other sketches and details. The CSB is continuing its investigation activities, including evidence collection, analysis of the parts and the process, to determine the cause or probable cause of the incident. The CSB is also evaluating the potential for an explosion that occurred in the process that resulted in the release of the molten sodium hydroxide during the incident. Additionally, the CSB is investigating several factors such as TSUSA safety management systems to identify any safety issues that were causal to this incident. The CSB will publish an investigation update when additional investigation activities have been completed and more information is available for release. Thank you for your attention. This concludes the update on the TSUSA investigation. At this time, I'll turn it back over to Executive Director Kleist.
Bruce, thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you, the rest of the team, for your work and that's been done so far in connection with this investigation. The next presentation will be made by investigator in charge Melike Yersis on the update on the Marathon Martinez Renewable Fuels incident. During the last business meeting, Melike presented the findings from the investigation update, and this presentation will just provide the audience with an update of the status of the investigation. Assisting with the presentation today is the Deputy Investigator in Charge, Tyler Nelson. So Melike, please proceed.
Thank you, Executive Director Kleist. My name is Tyler Nelson, and I'm the Deputy Investigator in Charge of the CSB's investigation of the Marathon Martinez Renewables incident.
And my name is Melike Yersis, and I'm the investigator in charge of the CSB's investigation of the Marathon Martinez Renewables incident.
On November 19th, 2023, at 12:21 a.m., a fired heater tube ruptured and a fire erupted at the Marathon Martinez Renewables facility in Martinez, California. The fire seriously injured one operator who was standing next to the furnace. After the incident, a normally closed manual valve was found open, which created an unintentional flow path around the heater.
The CSB published an investigation update in February 2024, which provides details about the events that led to the incident and can be found on the CSB's website, csb.gov. The CSB's investigation is ongoing, and the investigation team is currently analyzing 4 potential safety issues: fired heater low flow protection, heater combustion control, safe operating limits, and corporate standards and oversight. The CSB's complete analysis will be included in the final investigation report, which we expect to publish later this year. And that concludes our presentation for today. Thank you.
Well, Melike and Tyler, thank you for the update, and I'd also like to thank the members of the team again for your support in bringing the investigation to the current status it is today. We're going to move on now to presentations from the Office of Recommendations, and the first presentation will be on the recently adopted safety study entitled Remote Isolation of Process Equipment. Amanda Johnson will be making this presentation. So Amanda, please proceed.
Thank you. This week, the board issued a safety study entitled Remote Isolation of Process Equipment. As a result of the CSB's 2019 TPC investigation, the CSB concluded that improved requirements in both industry guidance and federal regulations are necessary to help prevent the recurrence of highly destructive and dangerous events involving the release of highly flammable or toxic materials that cannot be effectively and remotely isolated. The CSB committed to conducting further analysis of incidents involving lack of remote isolation capability. The CSB then initiated a safety study to review incidents investigated by the CSB and determine the action needed to address identified gaps and deficiencies in both industry guidance and federal regulations. This brief presentation provides a quick overview of the study's findings, investigations reviewed, and recommendations. The CSB found in the study that although good industry guidance has been available for many years, the guidance has not been consistently followed. The CSB continues to investigate incidents where the lack of effective remote isolation allows for incident consequences to escalate following a loss of containment. The CSB concluded in this study that industry has not fully recognized that the effective remote isolation of equipment containing hazardous material is critical to quickly stopping releases, which could reduce the number and severity of worker injuries and facility and environmental damage. Based on these findings, the CSB issued 3 safety recommendations in the study to address needed improvements in both industry standards and federal regulations. 1 to EPI, 1 to EPA, and 1 to OSHA. The study focuses on 6 CSB investigations. These investigations cover the Formosa Plastics propylene explosion that occurred in 2005, the Valero McKee refinery propane fire that occurred in 2007, and the ITC tank fire, the Kimco fatal fire and explosion, the PES refinery fire and explosions, and the TPC Group Port Neches explosions and fires, all of which occurred in 2019. As a result of these investigations, the CSB issued several recommendations to standard-setting bodies to address gaps identified regarding remote isolation. In Formosa, the CSB made a recommendation to CCPS to incorporate guidance for remote isolation. As a result, CCPS developed remote isolation for process equipment, which recommends the use of remotely operated emergency block valves from a safe location. The CSB closed that recommendation as acceptable in 2008. In Valero, the CSB recommended that API revise recommended practice 2001 to include the design, installation, and use of remotely operated isolation valves. As a result, API added section 5.4.3.4.2 on remotely operated valves and recommended the consideration of remotely operated isolation valves during a PHA. The CSB closed this recommendation as acceptable alternative in 2016. Finally, in PES, the CSB recommended that API update recommended practice 751 to require installation of remotely operated isolation valves on the inlets and outlets of all HF containing vessels and hydrocarbon containing vessels meeting defined threshold quantities. That recommendation remains open. While these developments have been positive, the CSB has determined that stronger requirements are needed to help prevent future similar incidents. In this study, the CSB also noted that in its 2003 Guidelines for Fire Protection in Chemical, Petrochemical, and Hydrocarbon Processing Facilities, CCPS included a flow chart for use by companies to help them determine where remote isolation equipment should be installed. The CSB applied this tool to all investigations included in this study and determined that its use would have helped prevent each incident. Yes, and there's a picture of the flow chart. It starts with the question, is it flammable or combustible? And next you move to, is it less than 2,000 gallons? Is it operating at an elevated pressure? And is it in a fire sensitive area? And tells you whether a valve would be required or not required. To conclude the study, the CSB issued 3 safety recommendations. The goal of these recommendations is for facilities with highly hazardous chemicals to evaluate and improve upon their remote isolation capabilities for major process equipment and atmospheric storage tanks, and for there to be established criteria for when remote isolation devices are required. The first recommendation is to API, which states the following. Develop a new publication or revise an existing publication or publications that should be applicable to various facility types, such as refineries, chemical and petrochemical facilities, terminals, etc., with major process equipment and atmospheric storage tanks that details conditions that necessitate the installation of remote isolation devices that may be automatically activated or remotely activated from a safe location, particularly during an emergency. When establishing these conditions, refer to the guidance published by CCPS entitled Guidelines for Fire Protection in Chemical, Petrochemical, and Hydrocarbon Processing Facilities, sections 8.1.10 and 8.1.11. At a minimum, the conditions should address major process equipment and atmospheric storage tanks, material volumes and weight, as well as flammability, corrosivity, and toxicity. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Thank you. The second recommendation is to EPA to update the RMP rule by expanding the requirements of 40 CFR Part 68 to include an evaluation of the need for remote isolation devices for major process equipment that can be remotely activated from a safe location or automatically activated during a release. The evaluation should be included in hazard assessments, hazard reviews, and process hazard analyses. And finally, the third recommendation issued today is to OSHA and states that they should update the PSM standard by expanding process hazard analysis or PHA requirements under 29 CFR 1910.119E3 to include an evaluation of the need for remote isolation devices for major process equipment that can be remotely activated from a safe location or automatically activated during a release. In addition, the CSB issues a call to action in this study for facilities with highly hazardous chemicals to assess whether remote isolation should be applied to major process equipment, even in the absence of formal requirements in industry standards and federal regulations. And if so, install effective remote isolation equipment in a location that is safe for workers to activate. And that concludes my presentation. So with that, I will turn it over, I believe, to Charles Barbie or Mr. Kleist.
Well, I'll make the transition, but thank
Okay.
you, Amanda.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you as well as the other members of the recommendations team that worked very hard to develop this safety study. And those would be Chuck Barbie and Adam Henson. And also I'd like to recognize Dan Tolima, one of our senior chemical incident investigators who provided technical support for the development of this safety study. The safety study underscores the importance of the use of these remote isolation valves as part of an organization's mitigation strategy in the event of an accidental release event. So we encourage organizations to revisit their mitigation plans to see where these valves may be best applicable, again, to reduce the significance and impact that these incidents do have on not only their facility, but the communities that surround their facilities. The next presentation will be made by Director Chuck Barbie, and he has multiple updates to give to the audience today on the status of our recommendation program. So Chuck, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Executive Director Kleist. Nothing like better than the opportunity to say wonderful things about my staff and some of the work that they've done. So here's an overview of some of the officer recommendation activities that occurred for just this quarter. As always, and with everybody else at the CSB, officer recommendation staff have been very busy. In addition to our normal recommendations work, this quarter we developed the previously discussed CSB safety study. And when I say we, the primary drafter of that was Amanda Johnson, who gave the presentation. She did a wonderful job. We updated Board Order 22. That is a board order which governs our recommendations program. It sets policy establishing what we do and what we don't do. And the update really was to make it consistent with current terminology and processes. But it is a pretty significant undertaking. And then thirdly, we worked with the board to help develop CSB public comments to two notices of proposed rulemaking. One was the Environmental Protection Agency's Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, notice of proposed rulemaking. And we made these comments predominantly focused on our Donaldson Enterprises Incorporated fatal firework disassembly explosion and fire investigation, where we issued a recommendation predominantly to tighten up the permitting process. And then we also provided comments for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration's emergency response notice of proposed rulemaking. Some of those comments included we wanted to make sure it did not exclude PSM covered facilities, and we wanted to make sure that those on-site emergency responders had operations level training versus awareness level training. Those letters, as well as the board order, can all be found on our website. If you go to About the CSB, down to Open Government, you'll find where board orders are, as well as all of our public comments. And then lastly, the CSB, not leastly, the CSB hit a major milestone. With the issuance of the 3 recommendations in the CSB safety study, we're pleased to announce that the CSB has issued its 1,000th recommendation since we began operations in January of 1998. Now, because we're in a public meeting and I had to think about, wow, how do we celebrate this major milestone appropriately? Now it's a party. 1,000's right. So, whoop, whoop. All right. That is all that I have to present from the Office of Recommendations. And with that, I will pass it back to Executive Director Steve Kleist. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chuck. The 1,000 recommendations certainly is a remarkable milestone, along with the other work that is accomplished by the agency. So I'd like to thank not only members of the investigation recommendations team, but the other groups that make all of this possible, from the Office of Administration, the Office of General Counsel, Government Affairs, and Public Affairs. Without their support, we would not produce the quality products that we do to enhance chemical process safety. So thank you all for your contribution to the agency's core mission. And with that, Mr. Chairperson, I will turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thanks everyone who gave us tremendous presentations today. I will say, for the viewing public, you're very fortunate that Chuck didn't put on one of his funny hats for the 1,000th recommendation announcement, but maybe you'll get to see one of those at a future meeting. But I would like to say just a couple of comments before we open it up to public comments as well. And I'll do that very quickly. But first, with regard to the BP Husky investigation, which we just issued a report on last month, and which you heard presentation on today, that was a very, very significant event for this agency. We launched that investigation in September of 2022, right after the incident occurred. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, the former chairperson of this agency had resigned and left the agency close to the end of July 2022. And so it was really the first investigation that Sylvia Johnson and I, who were the sole board members at that point, had to make a decision on about whether to authorize. We did that even though we were deep in the throes of figuring out how we were going to clear up the backlog. We had a number of outstanding investigation reports that needed to be completed, and we had to make a decision about taking some CSB staff off of some of those investigation reports that were currently in the process of being prepared, and the investigations themselves are being concluded. But this was such a very significant event at the BP Husky at Toledo refinery that we needed to do that. And I want to thank Executive Director Kleist, as well as all the folks in investigations and recommendations for the teamwork, along with everyone else in the agency, in order to pull off the deployment in September 2022 to the BP Husky incident, as well as get that report done in a timely fashion, even as we were in the process of drafting, preparing, and wrapping up investigation reports on 17 investigations in 17 months, as I indicated previously. So again, our deep gratitude and appreciation to everyone who played a big part in that. Then just a couple of short comments about the 2023 incidents at Dow and Honeywell, which we have investigations going into, and you heard those presentations today as well. As was indicated in those two incidents in 2023, there were no injuries involved in either, but it could easily have been incidents. Both occurred during the night when the night shift was on, when there were fewer employees, and given the substances that were released and involved in those incidents, and given the circumstances which the release occurred, had there been more employees on site, there could have been some serious injuries that took place. And had there been other different conditions as well, it's entirely possible that surrounding community could have put an even greater risk than they were when those incidents occurred. But as Drew Solly also mentioned, and as I had also indicated, we have a second investigation underway at the Honeywell facility, in which there was an injury that occurred due to a release of hydrofluoric acid. But what Drew didn't mention, and just for background information, that there was a third incident at the Honeywell facility back in 2021, in which there was a fatality when a release of hydrofluoric acid occurred when a gasket at the facility catastrophically failed. We have not launched a formal investigation into that incident, but it's certainly going to be something that we'll be covering in the course of the 2 investigations that we've got underway there at the facility now, as we look at as we look at Honeywell's practices and procedures and how they've dealt with those releases that have occurred there. So hats off to both the Dow and Honeywell crews. But I just wanted to also bring that up to let people know that we are very much aware of that 21 incident, and we'll be considering that as well as we go forward with the 2 investigations we have underway at Honeywell. And then just last but not least, just again want to congratulate the team on pulling together a really terrific and outstanding safety study that we talked about today. As Board Member Sandoval mentioned at the very beginning of this meeting, the use of remote isolation equipment is not something that's new. The technology is not new. It's a matter of the practices and guidelines and requirements that apply to that. And we are looking at how we can work with industry as well as our fellow agencies who have regulatory authority, which we do not, to put into place requirements for the use of remote isolation equipment under appropriate circumstances. And so this is a very important study for us. We think it can make a big difference in terms of protecting lives and preventing injuries, and also protecting surrounding communities. So we'll be working on that as we go forward. So stay tuned for that. And so having said all that, I just will now turn us to the public comment period. As I indicated in my opening remarks, if you want to make a comment, please use the icon on your screen to raise your hand so that Brian can recognize you and unmute you so you can make your comment. Generally, we try not to get into much detail. For those of you who have been participants in these meetings before, you're familiar with our practice. We try to discourage too many questions, but if we get a question that we can answer in a general sense without going into too much detail or talking about non-public information, I will certainly try to do that. As I also said at the beginning of the meeting, whether it's a comment or even a question, please try to keep your remarks to 3 minutes so that we will have time for everyone who wants to make a comment to do so, and we can allow folks to get on with their business today. And so with that, Brian, we'll open it up and see what's on folks' minds.
Steve, I am keeping an eye on the raise hand button.
I didn't provoke anyone into commenting at that point, huh? So
not yet, but if anyone needs to find it, the raise hand button is located at the very bottom. Looks like
there we go.
I think we have one.
A few there.
Hey, Michael, I've asked you to unmute. Let me know if you have any problems or if you're unmuted.
All right, well,
Yeah,
Mr. Owens, I'd like to just ask you a question. I'm quite impressed with the output of investigations your team has done and an organization that you and Dr. Johnson have brought to the equation. What was the main reason that you felt like your investigation team had fallen behind? What is it that was fixed? I'm just curious from a mechanical perspective of how your agency works and what caused the terrific turnaround that you guys have been able to achieve.
Well, thank you, Mike. And also, could you just identify yourself for us a little bit? Is it?
Yeah,
DuPont
sure. My name is
Mhm.
Michael DuPont. I am the Senior Director of Safety, Security, and Health at Rayonier Advanced Materials.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'll answer that question this way. I think we've talked about it a bit before in public meetings, and but and it just to be frank, we knew that there were some significant internal roadblocks to getting work done here. For a small agency, the CSB had an inordinate amount of bureaucracy. I don't think that's any secret. I think I've said that publicly in these meetings before. We had an extraordinarily talented team of investigators as well as people in other offices, whether it was OGC, administration, public affairs, all of whom I had a great deal of experience in their jobs, but we needed to figure out the best way for them to do their jobs. So we removed some of the internal roadblocks and improved the procedures for not only concluding investigations, but also preparing reports. And from the board's perspective as well as improving the process for board review and eventual approval when reports are approved for the board itself. So the board doesn't become a roadblock at the tail end. And if there are genuine questions that members of the board have, that they are addressed by the team in a timely fashion as well. So there were a combination of things that we did, but the bottom line, to be quite frank, was at least from my personal point of view, was figuring out a way to make their jobs and everybody else's jobs in the agency easier, and also to just get out of their way so that the people with the expertise and the experience, the investigators and the other folks who are involved in these investigations and the preparation of reports can do their jobs the way that they need to be doing them. The other big thing, just to be frank, was getting people back to working in teams. The CSB had gotten away from that when Sylvia Johnson and I joined the board. Essentially, the agency had one investigator working on 2 or 3 reports in some cases, and in most cases by themselves. And that was a recipe for not getting things done, just to be honest about it. And so we worked very closely with Steve Kleist and the other leadership in the Investigations and Recommendations Office to figure out how to create the teams that we needed to have in order to get reports done in a timely fashion. That meant taking people off some reports. It meant prioritizing some reports of others. It meant pushing some things off, but more importantly, it meant developing a realistic timeline and a schedule for getting the reports done. It got a little touch and go at times in terms of us keeping the commitment that we had made publicly, not only to all of you, but also to the families of people who had been injured or killed in these incidents, and the people who live in the communities around the facilities, as well as to members of Congress that we promised, to use that word, that we would clear up this backlog, and we would do it by the end of 2023. And everybody was pulling on the same oar there, Michael, and we got it done. So that was a longer-winded answer than I really intended to give, but I think it's just a tribute to the commitment and dedication of the people who've worked in this agency for many years, but also to all the people who've joined the agency recently. And I'll just add to wrap up is that one of the things that we also did was make a determined commitment to hire more staff at the CSB. When the former chairperson left the agency, and a couple of other people had left along with her, the agency was at its lowest level of staff in over 20 years, since 2001. So we set about prioritizing a hiring procedure, figuring out where we needed to fill the gaps first, and that was clearly hiring more investigators, and we've done that. We've still got more to do in that regard, but we also rebuilt the infrastructure of the agency in terms of the administrative team to support the investigations, which you've heard reference to today, as well as now most recently rebuilding the Office of General Counsel, so that we can have the agency getting close to at least hitting on all cylinders. So so it's really been a joint effort by everybody at the agency, and all of us talking together about how do we get this done. So does that answer your question? I hope so.
Next, we have Louis Bluns. Test you unmute.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Good. Yeah, exciting to see these investigations because I always think CSB, it's nice, a very nonpartisan technical tone on the videos about how do we solve the problem. There was most of these are giant plants. We're in the small industry. There was a sequins plant in Massachusetts that had an explosion. And I'm curious, is that one that you'll investigate? Sadly, it was a fatality.
First for Louis, who are you with? Or are you with a company?
Regis Technologies, we're a small synthesis company, but
Yeah.
you have the risk because you're doing so many different things at smaller scale, but still dangerous scale. So I always like to hear about it.
Well, no, I thank you for that. I will say, I'm certainly familiar, if we're thinking about the same facility up in Massachusetts when that occurred. As I made reference to when I was talking about the BP Husky incident, we had to make some choices about what we could do and what we couldn't do given the backlog. And also, to be quite honest, the limited resources that we have, because we are a very small agency. But, we've, in addition to the BP Husky incident, we launched another investigation, which we concluded after the NTSB took over. That was in early 2023. It was at the R.M. Palmer, I believe, the name of the facility in West Reading, Pennsylvania, was a chocolate manufacturing facility that had an explosion, and it was subsequently determined by the NTSB that it was within their jurisdiction. And when we have a situation like that where NTSB takes over, we move out of their way. But so we made a decision on that when there were 6 fatalities in that incident.
Oh, wow, sad.
There, so it was pretty serious. But as you might have gleaned from the presentations today, we've tried to pay a bit more attention to some of the smaller facilities more recently. In particular, for example, the TS USA facility. It's a TS USA as a company, and as Cruz indicated during its presentation, their parent company is headquartered in France, and they do have facilities all across the U.S. But the Chattanooga facility is a relatively small. I believe it's about 15 employees there. But there was a fatality, and because of that, we took it very seriously. The timing was good for us, to be blunt about it. We not only eliminated the backlog, we hired more investigators. We were coming to a conclusion in BP Husky, and we had the ability to initiate the investigation there at TSUSA. The other ones are relatively large facilities, but we are very mindful of the smaller facilities because they can seriously injure or kill someone just as easily as a large facility, and they can also put the surrounding community at very serious risk. And so one of the things that happens, just for your information as well as for everybody else on this call, is there have been references to Dan Talima. He's a senior incident investigator, longtime employee of the agency, who oversees our accidental release reporting rule program. We get incident reports on almost a daily basis. We get several a week. We have now up around 400, if not more, 400 incident reports that the agency has received since the reporting rule has been in effect, going back to March of 2020. Not all of those involve fatalities. Not all involve serious injuries. Not all involve significant property damage, but each of them involves one of those, and so at least. And so if we had the resources, we had the personnel, we could be investigating a lot more of those incidents, whether they're at big or small facilities. but we take them one at a time and as they occur. And we've been able to do the ones that we do, and we're hoping that we'll be able to continue to do that, depending on what happens in the budget process this year and for fiscal year for our fiscal year 25 budget and for future years after that. So Louis, well, thank you for your comment and your question. So.
Hey, Steve, next, it shows up as Solomon's iPhone, if you wouldn't mind stating your name.
I think we know who that is.
Okay,
All right, can you hear me?
we can.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. I'm Steve Solomon. I'm the Director of Health, Safety, Environment for the United Steelworkers. And unfortunately, two of the reports cover workplaces that we represent. And before I begin, just let me first say it's an honor and privilege to thank you for what has been done, Chairman Owens, board members Johnson and Sandoval. Your entire investigation teams, they've been mentioned, so I won't take the time to go through those names. But we just want to say that we second everything that's already been said. So I won't, go into all of the depths of that. But having been personally involved in the Ben and Max Morrissey fatality investigation, as well as our local union, if anyone has ever had the privilege and the honor of working with the CSB, you will find out how dedicated the chair, the board, and all of the staff, from the people who answer the phone to the people who give our members a hug when they are having tears streaming down their face and they're reliving the horrible nightmare that they have witnessed and cannot erase from the back of their minds. These people work night and day in their hotel rooms. We've seen them when we've come back to a hotel room and they're still in a conference room working to the wee hours of the morning, and they're right back there first thing in the morning, doing everything they can to get the lessons learned. And I just want people to understand how important this small agency is on a shoestring budget. And I hope that our government recognizes that going forward, and how much more that this agency needs, and the backlog that has been eliminated. We were worried that we was not going to get an investigation when we had the double fatality in the BP oil refinery. I would hate to think what it would have been like if we could not have gotten the CSB to that, and the lessons learned would not have been shared that has been published in this final report. If there's one thing that people don't see in these reports, is that the tears have been wiped away from the paper that it's been put on. And we just cannot thank you all enough for your professionalism, the empathy that has been shown to everyone, how you've handled everything from our members, the families involved. It's just been an incredible experience that I wished we never would have had to have gone through as our union, as our members, those families. And I'll just say that in the report on the BP fatality, we had an outside operator and an outside operator trainee, both with limited experience. And their experience, their knowledge levels was limited. And it's because of rotation. Too many workplaces are dealing with work organization hazards. They're understaffed, people are overworked, and they're doing more with less. Their job and their task experience and knowledge is reduced through multiple jobs within their assigned duties. The Crude One operator had 2.5 years in their assigned area, but in reality has less than a year's worth of experience and knowledge in each of the job of their assigned areas. This is really important, not only as the report captures, to have stop work authority, but it really needs to be meaningful stop work authority. There was all kinds of alarm floods going on, as mentioned. Days and nights wanted something done about it. And one person even said there needs to be a safe park of the refinery. Other people had mentioned it. And this is what happens when profits and production is put over people. And I hope that this report brings a lot of attention to a number of failures, not only within process safety, but occupational health and safety management systems. And there is where we need to look at the process safety management standard in California and in Washington, and how the federal standard needs to be updated. And we need to look at process safety culture. Clearly, there was a lack of culture when it came to process safety management. And I hope in the future that a video will follow up the report that will honor both Ben and Max Morrissey and their families and for what people have been through, so that no one else will ever have to relive this horrible, tragic event. And I also want to recognize the CSB for the work that has been done and the ongoing work that will continue to be going on with the marathon investigation, your update and presentation. The brother Jerome Serrano and family have been going through a very difficult time. And I just want to say, keep up the great work. And I apologize for the background noise as I'm sitting in an airport to give this.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. We, as you know, and I think many people on this call know, we work closely with all the stakeholders, including the steelworkers, USW, whenever there's a facility that is represented by USW. There's a lot of back and forth communication, a lot of involvement in the investigations themselves, and that happens both with the company as well as the union, in the case of BP, as well as Martinez with the USW. And it's very, very important to us as an agency to have that kind of involvement by both the companies and the union, and in some cases, other individuals who are involved there externally. So again, thank you for the support that you certainly have given the CSB over the years. You know, it wasn't that long ago when the CSB looked like it might not survive, but the USW, along with a number of companies and industry trade associations, came to the rescue and went to Congress and asked Congress to continue to fund the agency because of the strong bipartisan support that we had on the Hill, or have on the Hill. The agency was able to hang on and doing the things that we've been able to do in this administration. So again, thank you. And I do also just want to acknowledge one more time the role that Sylvia Johnson, Board Member Johnson, has played in working with the USW and communicating with the families of the Morrissey brothers. That is not an easy thing to do. She took that on herself and done it with a great deal of empathy and compassion and commitment to making sure that the families are kept informed of what the CSB is doing. And then last, just quickly, you mentioned the video. We definitely will be doing a video. We'll be doing videos on a number of the incidents that were part of the recently completed backlog, but certainly BP Husky, which is just issued, is going to be involved in some of the ones that we do sooner than later. And so we're very much looking forward to that. We're in the interesting situation of having completed so many reports in such a short period of time that we actually have a backlog of sorts in our video productions. It used to be that our video team would wait and for an investigation report to be completed so that they could do their work and get out our videos. But in this case, we've gotten so many of them done that they're kind of scurrying to keep on top of the number of reports that we've issued and get those videos out in a timely fashion. So they're doing a great job as well. And I should say, just very quickly, speaking of videos, that we did just post a video of an incident at the Lyondale cell facility from a few years back. Just came out last month, and there was a fatality at an acetic acid release at that facility. And if you've not had a chance to look at that, for everyone on this call, if you've not had a chance to look at that video, please go to our website, our YouTube page in particular, and take a look at that. It gives you a lot of insight into what really happened in that incident. And so again, thank you, Steve. And Brian, back to you. Do we have another comment?
I've got another one. Bob Baker, U.S. Air Force Safety Center.
Good afternoon, Chairman Owens and team.
Bob.
I greatly appreciate your investigations and the information that you provide. As noted, I'm Bob Baker. I'm the Chief Engineer for Air Force Occupational Safety. My question in a nutshell is, during your investigations, do you look at human factors as associated with the mishap sequence of events? As a former aircraft mishap investigator, having worked alongside with NTSB, we often would employ HFACs, human factors analysis classification system, looking at organizational influences, supervisory influences, as well as preconditions and acts of the individual in terms of decision-making processes. The reason I'm asking is I'm looking at the BP Husky event and specifically the use of stop work authority, and wondering what kind of organizational influences were associated with that in terms of production. Are they encouraged to use that or not? What kinds of decision aspects are there? So I'll be quiet and listen. Thank you.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. And you do, the Safety Center does great work in the Air Force. I will say that our acting general counsel is a Air Force veteran, and he never stops letting us know that when we're working with him on matters. So thank you for all your hard work there as well. To work backwards on your question with regard to the BP Husky investigation, that was certainly a topic of conversation during the course of the investigation, as well as the report development. It's sort of inherent in a lot of what is discussed in that report and the recommendations that we made. You noted in particular the stop work issue, which is clearly one of the more significant areas in which human factors did come into play, but also in terms of some of the decision making that was being made, partly as a result of the alarm flood, but also, to be honest, we didn't get into so much in the presentation, but it's in the report. When there was a transition between the day shift and the night shift, there had been a meeting that had occurred where they discussed various options, not shutting down the facility in terms of I think that was discussed in the meeting, but the decision was made not to shut down the facility. But there were certain ideas that were discussed and things that could be done, but for whatever reason, those were not communicated from the day shift to the night shift after that meeting. And so there are lots of different kinds of things that came into play in the BP Husky report that certainly involved decision making and human factors analysis and all of that. We just didn't call it out as that, but it's human factors is certainly something the agency has paid a great deal of attention to over the years, and we continue to do that. I will say it's been inherent in a number of the other reports that we've seen where, for whatever reason, a decision is not made to do something when there's information that indicates that something ought to be done. I think you heard that maybe even in some of the presentations today with some of the current investigations that are ongoing. But with regard to specifically the stop work issue, that is in part why our recommendation is worded the way it is. There are companies that have stop work authority, at least on paper, but how well it's actually implemented, what the understanding of by employees of their ability to actually employ stop work and to exercise that stop work authority is always a question when we get into these investigations. In this case, we made the recommendations we've made to the Ohio Refining Company, which is the subsidiary of Synovus, to make very clear in their stop work authority going forward, that employees clearly have that authority. And as Bill Steiner said when he was elaborating on it in his presentation, that they have training for employees and put together the kind of program where employees understand that they can, and in many cases, or some cases at least, should exercise stop work authority. And we saw that in the circumstances here, where there clearly seemed to be a situation where use of stop work authority was not only warranted but necessary, and it wasn't done at the refinery in the BP Husky investigation. And so that's all wrapped up into that recommendation, and we look forward to working with the company as they consider the implementation of that recommendation. So again, thank you, Bob, and thank you for everything you're doing. Anything else, Brian? Anyone else?
I don't see any other hands.
All righty. Well, I probably talked them into submission there, but before we wrap up, I want to turn it back over to my fellow board members, to Sylvia Johnson and Kathy Sandoval, for any comments they want to make, with the closing remarks or comments on any of the matters that were brought up during the public comment session, and then we'll bring this to a close. So Sylvia, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for your participation today. And again, thanks to this team for continuing to develop high quality and meaningful safety products. It's so important that our stakeholders continue to remain comfortable that we can be relied upon to carry out the work with the highest levels of professionalism and integrity here at the CSB. I think we've demonstrated that, as Steve Salmon talked about the BP Husky investigation in particular. That was a very challenging investigation on many levels, not only from the standpoint of the technical elements, but the emotions of dealing with sitting across the table from a mother, a father, two wives, a sister, and a brother-in-law who had lost two brothers in such a horrific way. And we don't just, as a team at the CSB, look at these reports as here's what happened technically, but we also like to bring a degree and element of thinking about and having compassion for the loss of life, because losing someone is hard in any situation, but to have your loved one go to work and not come back home is really a punch in the gut that ought not to be happening. And so as we continue to do this work, we are going to continue to meet the agency's mission, but we're also going to do it not only with scientific integrity, but also with compassion. So thank you all for coming to today's meeting, and we hope to see you at our October meeting. So Kathy, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. And thanks again to the entire staff and to the board members for your work and your commitment to get these reports done, and now to be carrying out 5 investigations simultaneously, as well as issuing new recommendations, following up on recommendations, and issuing the new safety study. So just a couple of themes to highlight from today. These are serious incidents that often involve workers, sometimes community members, being killed or seriously injured. We heard about Marathon, that the worker who was injured, 3rd-degree burns in the hospital for months. He's finally out of the hospital, but life-changing injuries. And you know, we know that the industry does take this seriously, but I think part of the lesson, and this gets back to often the human factors, is that protecting people and the planet often protects the plant as well, and critical infrastructure. And we have a legal as well as moral duty to do so. And a couple of themes I think that also really came up is that for many of these incidents, the technological facilities to control them are available. It's a question of making the decisions to implement them and to utilize them. So whether that's remote isolation valves or paying attention to the alarms and realizing that, in safety, you never want to get to the point where they call going over the horizon. And sadly, they certainly went over the horizon in part by not paying enough attention to what needed to be done in response to the thousands of alarms. The other theme that also came up was run to failure. And in my previous work as a commissioner of the California Public Utilities Commission, sadly, that was a theme that came up over and over again with certain companies that just let their equipment run to failure. And that often means not just stopping before it fails, but running through failure in a way that can lead to explosions, fires, toxic clouds, death, injury, destruction. In California, wildfires. It's a terrible thing. And so just really learning the lessons of failure, utter failure, legal failure, moral failure from run to failure, I think is really underscored by the gravity of what we've discussed. And just last, I would say on the question about investigating smaller plants, first of all, we rely on the reports, and we do as well look at other sources such as the National Reporting Center. So the reports are important. Sadly, there are chemical safety incidents reported almost every week in America, and we don't have the resources to investigate all of them. But we are now, with our Pathways interns who are recent graduates, doing more analyses of our reports. And in fact, some of those analyses have led us to do investigations of things that were reported at a time when we didn't have the resources, and we now have the deployment resources. So reporting is really critical, and we're doing the analysis, but also do let us know if you really think that there's something that could be investigated, because we also do hear that these lessons are beneficial to everybody, to communities, to workers, and to industry, insurers, to regulators. So that's our goal, is to create a safer America. So thank you, and thanks everybody for your work.
Well, thank you, Sylvia and Kathy. And again, thanks to everyone who participated in today's meeting. As always, we appreciate your involvement. It's very important to us to not only provide these updates to you, but to hear from you on these calls, as well as to communicate with you outside of these calls as well. As Sylvia said, we will be having another meeting in October. I don't believe the actual notice has gone out yet on that. We have 4 meetings, 1 a quarter every fiscal year. And our next meeting will be on October the 24th at 2 p.m., just as this one was, and others prior to it. But we will be doing a formal notice in the Federal Register about that. As we get closer to the meeting, there'll be an announcement sent out to everyone who's on our listserv as well. But pencil that in at least, October 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern time, and we look forward to seeing you all there and talking to you then. So, and with that, Brian, I think we're done. So.
Steve, I appreciate it. And I think that concludes today's meeting. Thank you for everyone for your participation and attendance.